So, welcome. So we're on lesson 8 tonight, 2 Kings chapters 2 and 3. So I'm going to just go ahead and get started. So it's not an easy thing to follow in the footsteps of someone who has been very successful and try to step in or replace them. This is true in like any manner of life, whether you're just like replacing a successful team member at work and like taking on a new role for someone who's been like done a good job, or whether you're filling in for someone who's like really good on your trivia night team and you're expected to kind of like step into their shoes. So, and the stakes only get higher the more high profile the role is. We as Americans really revere like successful leaders, particularly if they're like the founder of something, the entrepreneur. I can tell you that from personal experience. People's perspective on me changes when I'm like, oh, I started a business. All of a sudden they look at me differently. But you can't always be the first person who does a thing, or you can't always be called in to clean up someone else's mistakes. And this is a good thing. If we all had to create something from scratch every time and couldn't build on the legacy and the work of others, we just wouldn't get very far as a society if we were constantly having to redo everything over and over again. So it can be intimidating to follow someone who has been so successful. Feelings of insecurity and anxiety can arise and create negative consequences, both in your performance and just for your mental health, your overall well-being. So while it can be difficult to follow someone else's footsteps, particularly if they've been really good, we see the positive results when that transition is able to occur. And when someone who is equally successful and competent takes over for another highly successful person. So Apple comes to mind as a company that has navigated these waters well. Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple, is like he's almost a singular figure. He's almost a myth currently already. He helped create Apple. He led it to early success. He lost a power struggle in the mid-'80s and was forced out of Apple. And then he returned as Apple CEO in 1997 when the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. And he helped lead it to become, well, what we know today as Apple. And when he was forced out at Apple, he helped found and create this other small company called Pixar. That's really not a bad resume. So Jobs passed away in 2011, and current Apple CEO Tim Cook took over for Jobs in that year as well. There was immense pressure on Cook and the rest of the leadership team at Apple to keep the company going strong. After all, first time Jobs had left, the company had struggled for nearly a decade and nearly went under. But by every metric, they've done an excellent job of taking over for this visionary and founder, honoring his legacy and work in their own way, while not trying to perfectly replicate the man. Jobs was aware of this and gave advice to Cook, his successor, before he passed away. I'm reading here in an article from Bloomberg by Peter Burrows. Among his last advice he had for me and for all of you was to never ask what he would do. Just do what's right, Cook said. Jobs wanted Apple to avoid the trap that Walt Disney Company fell into after the death of its iconic founder, Cook said, where everyone spent all their time thinking and talking about what Walt would do. You can't do things the exact same way as the person who came before you did. You are not that person. You are someone else. You will not find yourselves in the exact same situations that this person you found yourself in. There's much wisdom to be gained from studying the past. We are in a Bible study after all. You kind of have to believe that to be here. But part of life is learning what it means to be this follower of Jesus and applying the logic and wisdom from this first century Jewish man and applying it to a 21st century. When we are able to successfully take the wisdom and knowledge from those that came before us, even those that cast a long shadow or we feel inadequate in comparison when we look up to, we can continue to build upon their legacy and take their work even farther. We here at BSF have built upon the legacy of woman A. Wetherell Johnson. The organization is not the same as it was when she founded it in 1959, but many of the same principles still carry through this organization 63 years later. It's a great thing we have such a firm foundation to rely on and help guide BSF into the 21st century. So these kind of swirling thoughts of successfully following and building on a legacy were on my mind a lot this week as I thought about Elisha's story and what it must have been like him for his last moments with Elijah as he's now starting his own ministry and having to fill in some really big shoes. He had to have been battling fear and anxiety when he realizes that Elijah is going to leave him and he will have the burden of being God's prophet fully rests on his shoulders. And yet we see Elisha stand firm in faith, both being a good friend to Elijah and showing his trust in the Lord. And we see Elisha carrying out the task set before him and taking and expanding on the ministry of his wildly successful predecessor. So let's dive into the text for this week. There are two sections for the lecture today. The first one being 2 Kings 2, Elijah's Ascent and Elisha's Emergence. Apologize in advance when I just slip up and use their names interchangeably, but I will try. So you have to love the Bible because we begin this week with the phrase, when the Lord was about to take up Elijah up into heaven in a whirlwind. I'm like, of course, I totally knew that the Lord was going to take Elijah up to heaven. Definitely not completely caught off guard by that. So this begs the question, why was Elijah taken up to heaven? So I think we can answer this question a few ways. First, we are reading Messianic literature. We've talked about that. And all these characters we study, they're creating this mosaic signpost for what the eventual Messiah will be like and do. Elijah is one of our major signposts. So it makes sense that God would choose him to have the honor of this moment of escaping physical death to be with God. Second thing I think this moment is a marker of in the Old Testament is the hope that we believe in of overcoming death, of life eternal with God. Elijah was one of two people in the Old Testament who were taken up by God and escaped physical death. The other one being Enoch in the book of Genesis. If you were with us for our Genesis study, we talked about him. And they were both faithful men who were righteous. They remain in right relationship with God. God taking them to heaven shows us that if we are so close to him, so in right relationship with God, we can escape the sting of death and be ushered into his presence. This is amazing. This is incredible hope. Of course, all of the other scriptures show us how hard this is and how often we fail to be in right relationship with the Lord. There's only two people who do it in the Old Testament. And that this leads us to the conclusion, we need someone to help us bridge this gap between us and God so we can have this hope. And we know that person is Jesus. So, aside on that, back to the main storyline. Elijah and Elisha seem to know that something is going to happen with Elijah. We aren't really sure how they know this. Elijah 3 times tells Elisha to stay put because the Lord has called him somewhere else. First to Bethel, then to Jericho, and then finally to the River Jordan. 3 times, Elisha refuses to leave with him, showing that he understands the importance of what is going to happen, and that he wants to be with his friend and mentor until the end. God uses people and circumstances to test us, which is happening to Elisha here. It's not a gotcha, it's not a pop quiz, but is a testing to reveal the truth of our hearts, shows us what we really believe our actions do. In this moment, this trying moment for Elisha, he is tested, and he passes with flying colors, showing him to be a worthy man of faith and worthy to inherit the mantle of Elijah. Twice, Elisha is confronted by groups, known as the company of prophets, who also apparently know what's going on. So the notes have a section on these groups, so read that. I'll give you the short version. We don't really know anything about them. Sorry, can't answer that question. Just one of these details that is lost in time for now, which is a good reminder. We are reading stories from another culture, from another time. We need to understand them on those terms, and sometimes we just we don't always get everything. So either way, these guys almost seem like, to me, they want to come like gossip with Elisha, but Elisha does not want to discuss the issue with them, not interested, continues to follow his mentor. Finally, we reach the Jordan River, and Elijah just kind of casually performs a miracle. We read about it in verse 8. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and 2 of them crossed over on dry ground. The Jordan River is one of the most important locations in the Bible. God parted the Jordan in Joshua 3 so the Israelites could enter the Promised Land. It's often used as a symbol of transition, of transformation, of leaving something old behind and entering something new. There's a reason John the Baptist performs his baptisms in the Jordan River when he was leading his revival movement, preparing the way for Jesus. It was important. This is just also one more sign that this is Yahweh's power. It's his power doing the work. Yahweh is the God who separates the sea from the land, all the way back in Genesis 1. He's the one who parts the river, so you don't get to part the Jordan River without God's blessing. We see that play out again. So just Elijah and Elisha cross the Jordan, leaving 50 men from the company of prophets behind. Elijah knows his time is coming, and we read about his final moments in verse 9. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replied. Elisha's answer kind of reminds me of Solomon asking for God and wisdom back in 1 Kings. Elisha knows that he needs God's power to continue this ministry. He knows Elijah has that power. Elisha here is not asking for literally double the power. He's asking for Elijah to make him his heir. Consider Elisha to be his firstborn son. In this culture, when a father split up his inheritance amongst sons, the firstborn was supposed to receive a double portion of that inheritance, which would make them the rightful heir. Elisha wants to inherit and continue Elijah's ministry, but he wisely recognizes that he needs the Spirit to do so. Elijah, however, knows that it's not up to him to anoint the next prophet, but it is up to God who will continue to choose this ministry. So he tells Elisha that if he sees God take him up to heaven, then he will be considered the heir, intuiting with the help of the Spirit that if God allows Elisha to witness the event, then he would also be blessed and trusted by God, because, it's just the two of them at this point. And sure enough, it happens. Chariots of fire separate them, and a whirlwind takes Elijah up to heaven, bringing Elijah into God's presence forever. This is a bittersweet moment for Elisha. He knows that he's inherited the Spirit of God from Elijah. He also knows that his friend has escaped physical death to be with God. These are good, wonderful things. And yet, it is always sad when someone leaves this earth and we no longer get to be with them, even if we know we will see them again someday, even if we just know they're believers. Death may have lost its ultimate sting, but it still hurts a lot, even when we know someone is like Elijah and that person is now in the Lord's presence. I was really glad we got this verse about Elisha tearing his garments in two, which was a sign of grief and mourning. It's important to make space for that in our lives, even when a believer passes. Elisha would not be able to move on to what's next for him until he properly mourned what was gone, what was lost. And we need to follow his example in times of transition. But now, Elisha has access to the Spirit of God. He heads back to the Jordan River, reading from verse 14. He took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and struck the water with it. Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah? He asked. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. This is my read, but I think we can still see Elisha struggling a bit with what happened to Elijah in his question to God. But he remains faithful and true to God and trusts in him to be there. God rewards his honesty and trust by revealing to Elisha that, no, you do have the blessing. You do have the Spirit of God in parts the Jordan River. Again, this is something that only God gets to do, showing him to be Elijah's successor and the representative of God. The company of prophets, even though that they just saw this happen, that he parted it with the mantle, they seem to have a hard time accepting this happened, and they go search for Elijah to no avail. So now it's official. Elisha is carrying on the ministry. To end out the chapter and the section, we get two smaller stories confirming Yahweh is on Elijah's side. Elisha's, dang it. The first one is a miracle of healing. Elisha is staying in Jericho, and the people come to him and ask for his help with unproductive water. So, some context for the story. Jericho was the first city that Joshua and the Israelites pronounced judgment on when they entered the Promised Land. You can read about this in the book of Joshua. So after the miraculous falling of Jericho's walls and the destruction of the city, Joshua pronounces a curse on Jericho. We read about it in Joshua 6:26. At that time, Joshua pronounced a solemn oath. Cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild the city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest, he will set up its gates. This is why the water at the time is bad and unproductive. People wanted to move back to the city. It's a good spot for a city, but God had pronounced his judgment on it. But God is more than a God of judgment. He's a God of mercy, of renewal, of restoration and healing. And he has Elisha show mercy on these people. God heals what he has judged, restoring the waters to be used forevermore. You can actually visit Elisha's spring today if you travel to the West Bank. It still is there. So this story kind of has the overall Jericho story, which we kind of get the small glimpse of here at the end, has the same beats as the flood story from Genesis. There's evil in the world. God pronounces judgment on it, but yet God also rescinds his judgment on it and restores what he has, restores it and pledges to remain merciful forever, despite the fact that the world remained an evil place after the flood, and the people in Jericho, they still sinned and could deserve judgment again later. God is the healer. We can place our hope for new life and renewal in him. And we can do that even if God is the one who brought the judgment or allowed us to face the consequences of our sin. Even in those circumstances, God will still heal us and breathe new life back into us, just like he did for the people of Jericho. In general, Elisha's ministry is more focused on healing and restoration, while Elijah's is more focused on pronouncing judgment and prophesying. This is another messianic parallel, setting us up to recognize what the Messiah in the future will be like. John the Baptist, he's the Elijah parallel, the one who prophesies and calls the people out for their sin. Jesus comes in after that and brings healing and restoration to the people, the instrument and vehicle of God's undeserved but wonderful grace. I say in general because we're going to go to the next story that we get about God's power and it working through the prophet is a disturbing story. There's just no way around it. Elisha is walking in Bethel now, and he gets insulted and accosted by some boys or some youth, depending on your translation. They shout, "Get out of here, Baldy." Elisha sees them, pronounces a curse on them, and then 2 bears come from the woods and maul 42 of the boys. That is the story. So, how do we understand this in light of literally everything else I just said about Elisha's ministry being powerful and healing, and then 42 boys get killed by bears? Okay, let's look at this story from a few different angles. First, we're missing some details on the actual age of the boys and the youth. Some people, when they read this, they imagine like 50 first graders running around, which it could be. It could be that. But I picture them more as teenagers, almost young men. And to be blunt, 50 or so teenage boys is a gang. 50 or so teenage boys is capable of a tremendous amount of violence and evil. A lot of violence and evil in the world has been done by people who are not 18 yet. I don't know that to be the case for sure. I don't know, but it could be. But I know the age wasn't 18, so it could be right. So I don't know the case for sure, but my assumption is they're not 10. I would say teenagers, you could be right, early 20s. Second, Baldy is likely not just a harmless insult or funny comment about his hair status. So balding was associated with leprosy in the Bible. Lepers are looked at as outcasts and exiles. They are people to be shunned, they're people to be not associated with, and they're people to be sent away. So, is this 50 first graders singing a funny song about a bald man? Or a gang of teenagers coming to God's prophet, declaring that he should be cast out, exiled from the community, and they actually have the power to do so? I don't know. But it changes the tenor of the story depending on what you see in the details. We also know Elisha did not control the bears or anything like that. He is not a druid from your D&D campaign. Elisha invoked God, and God made the judgment call, not Elisha. This helps me process the story because I have faith in God. I know he knows the condition of the human heart. There are times when we have no choice but to trust in God and his judgment, because we are not going to be able to intellectualize our way through every single thing we come across the Bible or that we come across in life. I tried, and it led me to tearing my faith down to the studs. God's will can be incomprehensible to us. He is an infinite being. We don't always get it. And we need to accept and submit to that sometimes. And in some ways, the story is one that I'm like, I trust you, God. I trust your judgment. It's a weird, disturbing story with some additional context. I get it a little bit more, but not fully. But I do trust in God. And he was the one who pronounced the judgment. Therefore, I trust him to do that, to make things right. One final way from the bear passage before we move on to section 2. I often hear people quote Romans 6:23 and say, "For the wages of sin is death." This is a stark example of the wages of sin being death, and it causes us to recoil because, in a sense, we know that we have sinned like the youth did and deserve a bear attack, I guess. We deserve death. That's like what it is. That's just stark. But because we have our hope and trust in Jesus, we do not receive that judgment from God, and we receive healing and eternal life instead. So I'm trying to focus on being thankful for God's delayed judgment of my sin, because it gave me time to know who Jesus is and accept him as Lord, and avoid the consequences that I also deserve. Because when you see those consequences, it's kind of frightening, which should motivate us to draw even closer to God, so we can be like Elijah and spend eternity in his presence. Our principle for the first section is God graciously raises up people to speak for him. God raised up Elijah in his time, and then he raised up Elisha to continue the work and to keep spreading God's word to his people. In a way, we are continuing on the work that Elijah and Elisha are doing. We are continuing the work and legacy of Jesus. If we can learn from their example and build upon what they've done, then we can be the hands and feet of Jesus when God raises us up to speak and witness for him. It is God who chooses to get to speak on his behalf, and on some level as believers, we all have been called to do that, to go and make disciples of the nations. So thank goodness we have a firm foundation in Jesus to go do that, and we can trust in God's Spirit to empower us, just like it empowered Elisha. So our second section tonight is 2 Kings 3, God's deliverance over the Moabites. So stop if you've heard this story before. King Jehoshaphat of Judah finds himself in a compromising situation because of the unwise partnership he made with the kings of Israel. And God shows him grace and delivers him and the people despite of this. We've talked about this a few times. But we get another example of it. There's another new king of Israel, Joram. Joram, he gets rid of the Baal items. That's good. But he still does evil in the sight of the Lord. His evil was like Jeroboam's. Jeroboam set up the golden calves so people could worship Yahweh at the golden calves instead of, what Yahweh said they were supposed to do, which is go to Jerusalem. There are people who claim to worship and know God, yet they don't actually follow the commandments or they really believe what Jesus said about himself. Jesus said in John 14:5, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. We don't get to just freestyle how we worship God. There is a prescribed way to do it. So the Moabites seem to think new king on the throne of Israel is a great time to test and see if they can stop paying this tax that Israel has put upon them. You can't have people not pay taxes when you're the king. It doesn't work. So Joram rallies the people of Israel to go fight the Moabites, and he also calls in Jehoshaphat to help him. So we talked about this extensively last week, but to review, this is not a simple decision for Jehoshaphat because of his choice to bind his family to their family through marriage. He is in a covenant relationship with this family, and covenant relationships between kings at this time were a big deal. So once again, he agrees to help with Israel with an ill-advised battle, and he even comes up with the plan. Am I going the wrong way? I sure am. Oh, this is not a very good, this doesn't translate well. Okay, but here's Israel. So they're going to go down here, cut through Edom, and then get into Moab instead of going this way, because this would have been much more protected and hard. So that's the plan. I should have made that bigger. Oh well. So Jehoshaphat comes across as very relatable and understandable to me. On one hand, it's really frustrating when people in your life make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And we grow so impatient with people who do that. On the other hand, I make the same mistakes over and over and over again, even when I receive God's mercy and I'm delivered from the situation, like Jehoshaphat did with Ahab. I also make the same mistakes even when I receive judgment and correction from God, like Jehoshaphat did with Ahaziah and their shipbuilding enterprise. It's hard to admit to ourselves, but we fail over and over again in similar ways, even when we don't want to. I also sympathize with Jehoshaphat because previous choices that he has made, they make this really difficult. They constrain what he can do. He faces consequences no matter which choice he chooses. Do you break your covenant treaty with Joram's family, or do you break your covenant relationship with Yahweh by engaging with sin? Granted, we know what choice you should make. We all can give the academic answer. But it's really hard to go against people you have this intimate, binding relationship with, even if you know it's going to lead you to sin. This is repetition from last week, but be careful who you become yoked to, because you can find yourself stuck in these choices, these cycles of sin, make it hard to get out of. So that's where Jehoshaphat finds himself, dealing with the consequences of his sin again. The armies are now in the desert. They must have got lost or something. There's no water, and Joram is lamenting the situation. But Jehoshaphat, to his credit, knows what you do in this situation. You call upon the Lord, and he does it through one of his prophets. This probably would have been better to do before any of this started, but so often we have to reach rock bottom before we're like, maybe I should ask God what to do. Better late than never. We can see how God is sovereign here. Elisha just so happens to be in the area, a place he has no real business being, which, come on, yeah. Elisha is at first disdainful to the king of Israel for the worship of his family and his false worship, but he ends up agreeing to appeal to God for the sake of Jehoshaphat. This is a good reminder. Our very presence can help bring blessing and God's saving grace to non-believers around us. God's grace just overflows, and others can be caught up in his saving grace as well, which hopefully they will take as a wake-up call and come to recognize the God who saves them. I also like the detail in the story that Elisha summons a harpist and has him play when he appeals to the Lord. Elisha is doing the same job that we've seen before, like Elijah and Micaiah, but he's doing it in his own unique way. When you are building on the legacy of others, you want to make sure you do the job and you do it well, but you don't have to be a carbon copy of someone else. God made you who you are and blessed you with your gifts, so you should use them for his glory. We also know that music is a powerful tool to connect people with God's word. It's nice to see examples of that in the Bible. So Elisha relays the word of the Lord, tells the kings God's going to provide water miraculously, and he's also going to deliver the Moabites into your hands. This grace is way more than they deserve, but God's grace is unrelenting, even for those of us who find ourselves stuck in these cycles of sin. It's not good to be stuck in a cycle like this, but if you find yourself in a situation like Jehoshaphat did, keep turning to God every time, no matter what, because he will always be there for you, ready to give you grace and show you mercy, even if you've been there before. God's promises always come true, and in the morning, there was water in the desert that seemed to come from nowhere. The thirsty and lost Israelites had graciously been given new life, even when they were just wandering in the desert. And God's mercy was doubled because the very same water he provides tricks the Moabites. They think the desert is filled with blood. They foolishly attack the three armies, and they're routed. What happens next is more of what Elisha promises. The Israelites invade Moab. They're completely successful in their invasion, and they're beating down the walls of the final city. So Mesha, king of Moab, tries to break through the army through Edom's line, another country who was along with them. He uses a smaller strike force, fails in that effort. Then we get this one final strange verse. This passage has a few of them, but this one might take them all. So let's read about the king of Moab's last-ditch effort. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a sacrifice on the city wall. The fury against Israel was great. They withdrew and returned to their own land. So this is a revolting act, like an ultimate evil act by a desperate king. He is attempting to appeal to his god, Chemosh, by offering a human sacrifice. Not just a human sacrifice, but the sacrifice of his firstborn son and heir. And it works? Or it seems to work? This verse is really hard to understand. When I read the BSF commentary, the first line was, "This verse is very difficult to understand." So don't worry. If you read this and you were like, huh? That's everybody's reaction. This verse is difficult to understand, and I think a lot of it is the linguistic choice the author made when he said, the fury. It can also be translated as the wrath or indignation. Whose wrath? Whose fury? Chemosh? Yahweh's? The Moabites? It's like open-ended. So we don't need to reach a definitive conclusion on what happened here, because we have not reached a definitive conclusion on what happened here in 2,000 years of being believers. We are probably not going to solve it tonight. I am sorry. We know the Bible is completely trustworthy and true, but that doesn't mean we are going to completely and perfectly understand every line and verse, because that's not the point of this. The point is the text leads us to our faith in our Creator and our Savior. I am always down to discuss various rabbit holes and like forks in the road. I read a lot about this stuff. If you want to get a coffee or find me after class or get a beer, I got plenty to talk about this verse. Don't worry. But I don't want us to miss the forest for the trees. This is just one tree in the vast forest known as the Bible. So when I was like, in my worst phase, I would look at these trees and all of a sudden the whole Bible would just look like this one tree. And I could no longer understand anything else. So I don't want to use it as a cop out, but truly, if you get stuck on something like this and miss the whole rest of the story, you can end up missing God's grace in the bigger picture. So, like I said, I am happy to talk about this stuff, and if you're interested. But I'm going to present one view. I'm going to present the BSF's view, Dr. Hannah's view. I think that's my view on it too, but I obviously am not very confident in it. So, but yeah, so the people who've done the research on this know a lot more than me. But if you have more questions, yeah, come find me after class. So, here is what Dr. John Hannah has to say about this verse. Did the armies leave because the sacrifice was so denigrating, shocking, and dehumanizing? The word against can be translated as upon. If so, the horror was experienced by Israel, and they departed. The text does not indicate the wrath or indignation came from God. That's what makes it so weird. Further, the phrase coming immediately after the human sacrifice seems like it indicates a reaction to it. For the victorious armies, enough was enough. So BSF's read on it, I think what I actually do think is the best read on it, despite all the crazy theories I read, is that the Israelites react in horror and disgust at the sacrifice and choose in this moment to leave the battle. So if you don't agree with that, that's okay. That's okay. So no matter how the situation went down, the bigger picture, God once again saves Jehoshaphat and the people of Israel, and when they needed his grace. And the final principle for tonight is God graciously reveals his power and calls people to know him. God showed immense and incredible powers over his creation in this passage. And he didn't do so just to be like, flex his God muscles or whatever. He did so that people would come to know him and so that he could give and show love and grace to the people he loves, his images, his people. So God is so incredibly good to us, even when we fail him in the same ways over and over again, like Jehoshaphat did. So no matter what situation you find yourself in, let yourself go back to God for healing, for deliverance, and for restoration, even if you've already been there before, so that you can continue to do the work that he has set before you.